The back of the police car felt cold and uncomfortable. Jamal sat there, hands cuffed behind his back, his heart racing. His thoughts were spinning. Why is this happening? What did I do wrong? He couldn't understand why the officer was treating him like this. He was just a teenager trying to get home, but now he was trapped in the back of a police car, feeling helpless and scared. The officer, who hadn't said another word since he slapped the cuffs on Jamal, drove in silence. Jamal couldn't see where they were going, but he knew it wasn't his neighborhood. His stomach twisted with fear. Was he being taken to jail? How was he going to explain this to his parents? He didn't know what to do. Minutes felt like hours. The car made sharp turns, and the city streets passed by in a blur. Jamal tried to keep calm, but the tight cuffs cutting into his wrists made it hard to think clearly. He knew that no matter what he said, the officer wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind about Jamal being guilty of something, even though Jamal had done nothing wrong. The car finally came to a stop. Jamal heard the sound of the engine shutting off and the officer's heavy footsteps as he got out of the car. Jamal's nerves shot up again. He had no idea where they were. The officer opened the door and jerked him out of the back seat, dragging him toward the station. Jamal didn't know what to expect, but it sure didn't feel like he was being treated fairly. Inside the station, the lights were bright and harsh, and the noise of the busy police officers made Jamal feel even smaller. He could feel the eyes of strangers on him as he was led to a small holding cell. They didn't even bother to ask him for his side of the story. It felt like no one cared to listen to a young black boy, even though he knew deep down that he hadn't done anything wrong. The officer shoved him inside the cell and slammed the door. Jamal stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He felt alone, confused, and more than a little angry. What's going on? Why won't anyone listen? He wondered. He wanted to scream, to demand his freedom, but he knew that wasn't going to change anything. The system felt so big and unfair, and he was just one person. Minutes turned into hours. Jamal tried to sit on the cold bench, but it was hard to find comfort when everything around him felt wrong. He thought about his family, his mother and father, who would be worried sick by now. They'd never let something like this happen. Jamal was supposed to be safe, not locked up in a police station for no reason. He didn't know how long he had been there when an officer came to speak to him. The officer looked at him through the bars with a blank expression. "You're not supposed to be here," the officer muttered before walking away. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Was he going to get out? Was this all a mistake? But the waiting continued. Jamal didn't know how much longer he could stand it. Time dragged on, and all he could think about was getting home, proving that he wasn't guilty of anything, and making sure this didn't ruin his life forever. It was an ordinary afternoon when Jamal, a 16-year-old high school student, was walking home from school. The sun was shining, and the streets were buzzing with people going about their daily routines. Jamal, with his backpack slung over one shoulder, was lost in his thoughts. He'd just finished a math test that he thought he had done well on, and he was looking forward to relaxing when he got home. He never imagined that this simple walk home would turn into the worst day of his life. As Jamal crossed the street near a local park, he noticed a police car slowly driving in his direction. It wasn't unusual to see cops in the area, but something about the way the car was creeping along made him feel uneasy. The officer inside the car stared at him for a moment before suddenly pulling over. Jamal felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't know why, but he had a bad feeling in his gut. The officer stepped out of the car, and Jamal immediately noticed the look in his eyes. The officer's expression was stern, and his posture was tense, as though he was ready for a fight. "Hey, you. Hold up," the officer shouted, motioning for Jamal to stop. Jamal froze, confused. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He hadn't even looked at the officer the wrong way. He turned around slowly, trying to stay calm, unsure of what was happening. Is there a problem, officer?" Jamal asked, trying to be respectful but also feeling his nerves rise. The officer didn't answer immediately. He took a step closer and then barked. "Where are you headed?" "I'm just walking home from school," Jamal said, pointing in the direction of his neighborhood. He was starting to feel more uncomfortable now. Why was the officer talking to him like this? He didn't have anything on him, and there was nothing out of the ordinary about the way he was walking. The officer narrowed his eyes. "You look suspicious. I'm going to need to see some ID," he ordered, his voice sharp. Jamal's stomach tightened. He didn't want to argue, but he wasn't doing anything wrong. "I don't have my ID on me right now," he said, his voice a little shaky. The officer sneered. "Well, you'd better have a good reason for that, because I'm not buying your story. Stay right there." He reached for his radio, and Jamal knew that this was not going the way he'd hoped. Panic started to set in. Jamal was scared. He didn't understand what was going on. He had no criminal record, no history of trouble, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for no reason at all. He thought about running, but he knew that would make things worse. The officer was already too close, and Jamal had seen enough news reports to know that it could turn violent if he made the wrong move. The officer's voice broke through his thoughts. "I'm going to have to arrest you," he said. "You're under suspicion for being involved in a crime." Jamal's eyes widened in disbelief. "What crime? I haven't done anything wrong," he exclaimed, but the officer ignored him, grabbing his arm roughly and twisting it behind his back. Jamal winced in pain. He struggled to break free, but the officer's grip was too strong. As Jamal was handcuffed and forced into the back of the police car, he couldn't believe what was happening. The street was quiet, and not a single person spoke up. Jamal was just a boy, trying to get home, and yet now he was being treated like a criminal. As the car door slammed shut, Jamal's mind raced. Why was this happening to him? Why was the officer doing this? Jamal barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced with questions. What will happen next? Will I ever get out of here? The small, cold cell felt like it was closing in on him. The bright lights above flickered every so often, making the place feel even more uncomfortable. He kept replaying the moment when the officer had arrested him, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. But there was nothing he could think of that would explain why he was being treated this way. He had done nothing wrong. Why was everyone ignoring that? Hours later, a knock on the bars startled him. It was a new officer, a woman with short, dark hair. She wasn't the one who had arrested him, but Jamal noticed she was looking at him differently. She seemed calmer, more understanding. She stood in front of his cell and spoke quietly, as if she wasn't sure what to say. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. Jamal looked up at her, his eyes red from lack of sleep and frustration. "No," he replied honestly. "I'm not okay. I didn't do anything. I don't even know why I'm here." The officer sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I know. I've seen your case come up. You're not supposed to be here." Jamal felt a flicker of hope. Not supposed to be here. Could this really be a mistake? Was he going to get out soon? His heart started to race again, this time with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The officer unlocked the cell door and stepped inside. "I'm going to help you," she said. "But it's going to take time. There are people working on your case now." Jamal didn't know what that meant, but he wasn't going to argue. If someone was finally listening to him, then maybe, just maybe, things would turn around. She handed him a small bottle of water, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jamal took a deep breath and relaxed, just a little bit. The officer left soon after, and Jamal was left alone again. But now he had a glimmer of hope. The weight on his chest wasn't quite as heavy. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least he wasn't completely alone anymore. There were people out there who cared about what happened to him. And maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. When he was finally allowed out of the cell hours later, his parents were waiting for him. Jamal's mother looked at him with tearful eyes, clearly relieved to see him in one piece. She wrapped him in a hug so tight that he almost couldn't breathe, but it was the kind of hug he needed. It reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. His father, standing by his side, gave him a small smile, but Jamal could see the worry in his eyes. They were there to get him out, but the battle wasn't over. The officer who had arrested him had done something wrong, and Jamal wasn't going to let it slide. He had to clear his name, and that wasn't going to be easy. But as he walked out of the station with his parents, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt determination. No one was going to get away with treating him like a criminal when he hadn't done anything wrong. As Jamal stepped out of the police station, the cool evening air hit his face, and for the first time that day, he felt like he could breathe again. His parents were beside him, their faces a mixture of relief and concern. They didn't speak much as they walked to the car, but Jamal could feel their support without words. His mother held his hand tightly, as though afraid he might slip away. His father's jaw was clenched, and though he didn't say anything, Jamal knew how angry he must have been. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring outside the windows. Jamal stared out at the world he knew so well, but now everything felt different. Nothing felt the same after what had happened. His mind kept racing, playing over every detail, every word from that moment when the officer had first stopped him. Why did this happen? He kept asking himself. He hadn't done anything wrong, and yet it felt like the world had turned against him. When they arrived home, Jamal's mother immediately pulled him into the kitchen and sat him down at the table. His father stood nearby, pacing, clearly trying to figure out what to do next. "We're going to get through this, Jamal," his mother said gently, her hand resting on his. "But we need to talk about what happened." Jamal nodded, his throat tight. "I don't understand, Mom. I was just walking home. The officer didn't give me a chance to explain myself. He just arrested me for no reason." His mother's eyes softened, and she gave his hand a squeeze. "I know, baby. It's not right, and we're going to make sure it doesn't go unnoticed. You shouldn't have been treated that way, but we need to be smart about this." Jamal looked at his father, who stopped pacing and turned toward him. "You're going to need to tell your story, Jamal," his father said. "We need to make sure people know what happened. We have to make sure the officer who did this is held accountable." Jamal felt a knot form in his stomach again. He had always been taught to trust the police, but this situation had shattered that belief. The officer had not treated him with respect. He had treated him like he was a criminal when he wasn't. It made Jamal question everything. How could the system fail him like this? His parents could see the pain in his eyes, but they weren't going to let him face this alone. "We'll help you, Jamal," his mother said. "We'll make sure your voice is heard." The next few days were a blur. Jamal's family worked tirelessly to figure out what steps to take. They met with a lawyer who listened to Jamal's side of the story and promised to help. The lawyer explained that what the officer had done was illegal. Jamal didn't know much about the law, but he was learning fast. His story wasn't just about what happened to him. It was about standing up for what was right. His parents made sure to spread the word to the community, and soon, others began to speak out. They shared their own experiences of police mistreatment, and Jamal realized that he wasn't alone. The support came pouring in, and it felt like a weight was being lifted off his shoulders. People believed in him. He wasn't just some kid in a system that didn't care about him. He was a person, a young man, and his voice mattered. The feeling of anger was still there, deep down inside. Jamal hadn't forgotten the way the officer had treated him. But now, instead of being afraid, Jamal felt empowered. His fight wasn't over, but he was no longer fighting alone. The days seemed to drag on as Jamal's case gained attention. The more people heard about what had happened to him, the more they spoke out. He wasn't just some random kid in a police station anymore. He was the face of something bigger, something that many others had experienced, but never been able to speak about. It was clear that what happened to Jamal wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Jamal didn't expect to become a symbol. He didn't ask for this kind of attention. All he wanted was to go home, to be treated fairly, to be able to walk through his neighborhood without fear. But as the story spread, Jamal realized that his experience was part of a much larger issue, one that affected many people in his community and beyond. The news reports started to pick up the story. Journalists called his family, asking for interviews. Jamal felt overwhelmed at first, unsure if he wanted to share everything with the world. But his parents were there, guiding him through each step. They helped him understand that his story could make a difference. His voice mattered. One afternoon, the lawyer who had been working with them called with an update. "We've filed an official complaint," the lawyer said. "The police officer is being investigated, and there will be consequences for his actions." Jamal couldn't believe it. He had felt so small when he was sitting in that cell, like nothing would ever change. But now, there was a glimmer of hope. The officer who had treated him so unjustly was finally going to be held accountable. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step in the right direction. As the days turned into weeks, Jamal's anxiety grew. His life had been turned upside down, and he was still waiting for justice. He went back to school, but things were different. His classmates had heard about his arrest, and though most of them offered support, some didn't know how to act around him. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that people were looking at him differently, like he was somehow changed. His teachers treated him with more care, as if they were waiting for him to fall apart. But Jamal wasn't falling apart. Despite the stress, despite the long wait for justice, he kept going. His parents made sure he had time to relax, to talk with friends, and to just be a teenager again. It was hard, but Jamal knew that the fight he was facing was bigger than himself. He wasn't just doing this for him. He was doing it for everyone who had been treated unfairly, for everyone who had felt powerless. One day, while walking home from school, Jamal noticed something that made his heart swell with pride. People in his neighborhood had started to put up signs. "Justice for Jamal," they said. Some were even painted on windows, bright and bold. It was a sign that his community had his back. They were standing up with him, and that made all the difference. That moment reminded Jamal of why he was fighting. This wasn't just about one bad officer. This was about making sure that everyone, especially young black men like him, wouldn't have to live in fear. He wasn't alone. And soon, more people would know that they didn't have to be silent anymore. Weeks passed, and Jamal's case continued to gather attention. More people came forward, sharing their own stories of police mistreatment. Jamal was amazed at how many voices had been silenced for so long, but now, they were all coming together. It was like a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Jamal knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been wrongly accused, unfairly treated, and ignored. The investigation into the officer who had arrested Jamal was moving forward. Jamal's family continued to meet with their lawyer, who had become a steady guide through this difficult process. There were legal battles ahead, but the pressure on the police department was growing. Jamal could feel it, even if it didn't seem like things were changing overnight. The community support kept building, and it wasn't just limited to his neighborhood anymore. People all over the city were speaking out, sharing their thoughts on social media, and showing up at rallies. One day, Jamal's parents sat him down to tell him some important news. "The officer who arrested you has been suspended," his father said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "They've started an internal investigation, and things are moving forward." Jamal felt a rush of emotions: anger, relief, hope. But there was something else, a feeling of justice finally starting to take shape. It wasn't everything, but it was something. But even with this news, Jamal knew the fight wasn't over. There was still a long way to go before he would feel like things were truly right again. The officer had been suspended, but that didn't mean he was gone for good. Jamal wanted to see real consequences, real change. He wanted to know that the system would treat him fairly, just like anyone else. Jamal began to understand something important through all of this. The fight wasn't just about one person, one officer, or one incident. It was about the system. It was about how many people were overlooked and mistreated, and how this had been going on for far too long. He wanted to be a part of the change, to be a voice for those who had been silenced for years. At school, Jamal noticed something else. His classmates, the ones who had once avoided him or treated him differently, were now speaking up as well. They had seen the rallies, the signs, and the messages of support. They were starting to understand what had happened to him and why it mattered. Some of them even came up to Jamal to apologize, to tell him they hadn't known how deep the issue really went. Jamal didn't know what to say at first. He wasn't used to people apologizing for things that had hurt him, but he realized that this was a step forward. People were learning, and that meant something. Slowly but surely, the ripple effects of his story were changing the way people thought, and that was powerful. The tension was still there, and Jamal knew he couldn't rest until real justice was served. But as he walked home one evening, he saw something that made him smile. The same signs that had been posted in his neighborhood were now up everywhere. The message was clear: we won't be silent anymore. It wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been hurt, every person who had felt like they didn't matter. Jamal realized that this fight was bigger than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about the wrong that had been done to him. It was about fixing what was broken. And though it was a hard road ahead, Jamal felt more certain than ever that change was possible. The day Jamal had been waiting for finally came. The officer who had arrested him was going to stand trial. It felt unreal to Jamal that the moment was actually here, that his fight for justice had come this far. There was a nervous excitement in the air as Jamal and his parents prepared for the trial. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, everyone who had been ignored by the system. Jamal realized that his story had become more than just a personal battle. It was now a movement, a call for change. Jamal and his family sat in a courtroom, the air thick with tension. The officer sat on the other side of the room, his face unreadable. Jamal felt a mix of anger and fear, but also something else: determination. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. The trial began, and Jamal could hear the lawyer representing the officer trying to discredit his story. They twisted the facts, tried to make it seem like Jamal was exaggerating or lying. But Jamal didn't let it shake him. He knew the truth, and the truth was all he needed. When it was his turn to speak, Jamal felt his heart race. He had practiced his statement so many times, but now, with all eyes on him, the words felt different. He took a deep breath, looked at his parents for support, and began to tell his story. He spoke about what had happened the night he was arrested, how he was treated, and how the officer's actions had shaken him. He spoke from his heart, and his words were powerful. They were honest. They were raw. Jamal could feel the weight of the room shift as he spoke. It wasn't just his voice anymore. It was the voice of everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been silenced. His words carried the pain of those who had felt powerless, the frustration of being treated unfairly, and the hope that things could change. Jamal wasn't just talking about what had happened to him. He was standing up for a future where this kind of injustice would no longer be accepted. The trial went on for days, but in the end, the truth could not be ignored. The officer was found guilty. It wasn't an easy victory, and it wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a win. Jamal's heart swelled with pride. He had done it. He had stood up for himself and for so many others who had been treated like he was invisible. When they left the courthouse, Jamal's family was filled with a sense of relief and hope. They knew there was still much work to be done, but this victory felt like a turning point. Jamal had become a symbol of strength and courage, not just for his community, but for people everywhere who had been wronged. His story had sparked something in others, and that was the beginning of a change that couldn't be undone. As they drove home, Jamal looked out the window, thinking about everything that had happened. He had learned so much during this journey. He had learned that no matter how small or powerless you feel, your voice matters. He had learned that standing up for what's right could change the world. And most of all, he had learned that justice, though hard to come by, was worth fighting for. Jamal knew that his journey wasn't over. There were still many battles to be fought, but this was just the beginning. He wasn't just the kid who had been arrested unjustly. He was a young man who had fought for his rights, and in doing so, he had become a beacon of hope for others.